Welcome, listeners, to a brand new bonus episode of Oh My Word podcast. And today we're going to do another special, sort of like the ones that we've done before. We're going to go behind the scenes of one of my books. This time, Beautiful to Me, which is the Little Mermaid retelling part of the End of Ever After series. It's the third installation in a series. There's 5 books altogether. There are companion novels. They can be read in any order. I would recommend the order that they were printed in, just to be careful about spoilers, but you could read them in any order. On that note about spoilers ahead, either pause right now, get the book, paperback, ebook, audiobook now, check it out there, or you can listen and then hear what's going on behind the scenes and then see, as you're reading, how all these parts have come into play in the story. So, let's get into it. Beautiful to Me is the retelling of The Little Mermaid, which was originally written by Hans Christian Andersen. Unlike other fairy tales that have been passed down through different generations, this one was never a grim fairy tale, which a lot of Disney stories are based on. It's a relatively younger fairy tale. Also, the story that Hans Christian Andersen told is actually a religious story. That we have this mermaid, she wants to become human because she thinks that humans have souls, and she wants to have a soul. So there's a big theme about souls coming into play, which is a very big religious aspect of it all, which is why I also chose to bring that into my retelling, because when I did these retellings, instead of taking the story and adapting it to a modern tale or, showing the basic plot line and just a whole new tale, I wanted to stick to the original story and just expand upon that original story. Theoretically, if you were to take away all the parts that I added in, the original story would still be there. Certain parts change, but not really that much. Sometimes the change is more, let me explain how this happened, but most of the notes are still there. Which means, going back to the original Little Mermaid tale, there's a mermaid and she's watching the people. She wants to become a person. She wants to have legs. She trades her voice for a pair of legs, becomes a human. She has to get a prince to fall in love with her so that she could be a human forever. If not, she's going to die. And the prince first kind of pays attention to her, but then he ends up going after another woman and marries another woman. The mermaid has one chance to save herself. She chooses not to, and she just dissipates. She becomes part of the foam of the sea. That's what happens with mermaids after their lifespan. For her, she's about, I think, 15, 16 years old when this occurs. So, really, she's 15, 16 in the way I told the story. So, her life is very much cut short. Which means, if her life is cut short, and these are supposed to be retellings that keep the original tale intact, the Little Mermaid, the original Little Mermaid, theoretically can't be the protagonist of the story, because then who's telling the story? Especially because the style of these stories is a memoir style. Oh, you all know this tale? I'm going to explain the story to you. I'm going to give you the information that they don't always say when they're telling it over, when they're telling it to children by bedtime, or they're saying it around the campfire. They leave a lot of details out. They've abridged the story, they've shortened the story, kind of where they were interested in, that's where they stopped the story. I'm going to tell you the full story now. That's kind of the tone of this memoir-style retelling. So who's telling the story then? When I approached this, I had to have someone tell the story, especially if this Little Mermaid was going to die at the end, which she doesn't do in the Disney version. So I chose that the person who was going to tell the story was going to be the person who the prince actually marries, because the prince married another woman who was not the mermaid, so she's going to be the storyteller. Then, to take things a step further, how does she know the whole story if the mermaid could never told over her story? She is actually a mermaid as well. The way the story is told is that you have the Little Mermaid. She sells her tongue, for a pair of legs because she wants to have a soul. The person who becomes the other woman that the prince marries is another mermaid that has been sent to bring her back. She makes a bargain with the sea witch, who is not shown as being evil in the story. The sea witch is just kind of a witch who kind of balances out the powers between the king of the sea and then you have the sea witch. There's a balance of powers there. She makes the deal, lets the mermaid go on her way, kind of watches what's going on, sees that it's not working out well. The mermaid is not doing things right. She doesn't want to go back on her word, so instead she sends someone else to go after the mermaid to say, hey, let's break up the contract and figure something else out. That other person who's being sent after her, that is the narrator of the story. That is the protagonist. That's the one writing the memoir. Also, which is kind of skipping to the end a little bit, the person who was telling the story, her name is Ariel. The other mermaid, the original mermaid that starts the whole thing, her name is Sienna. And we'll see at the end that's sort of what happens as she's trying to explain why come everyone thinks the mermaid's name is Ariel if it's really my name. Ariel's not the one who died because I'm the one who stayed alive. She kind of talks about how she She used to make these hedges. She made a hedge that looked like a mermaid, and everyone just over the years confused the maker of the hedge for the actual representation of the hedge. The hedge looked like a mermaid. It was crafted by someone named Ariel. Over time, they're like, oh yeah, that's Ariel. Instead of just saying, that's Ariel, the hedge Ariel designed, that's Ariel. So I decided, oh, the mermaid must have been Ariel. It's kind of a nudge or a nod to the Disney version, like, you confused the two names. Which anyways, it's obviously, they changed the telling a little bit. In addition to now this new mermaid that's been added in, some of the main themes of the story, which kind of dictated the way that the story was told, there's two parts to this. One, we have this idea of obsession on the part of Sienna. She wants so much to have a soul. She wants so much the human world. She thinks the human world is worth so much more than the mermaid underwater world that she's willing to give up everything for it. As a general idea, a lot of people, we don't automatically shy away from this idea of sacrificing to get something that's worth more to us. A lot of people have done that and will do that and do that every day. This is worth more to me, so I'm willing to sacrifice certain things for that. The difference is that with Sienna, it's from a sense of obsession. So she makes this sacrifice from a very misguided point of view, and she continues on it. She sits so heavily on it that even when she has a chance to save herself and undo what's going to inevitably lead to her death, she still won't do that. She basically almost doesn't know how to handle the big decision that she's made. And part of how we see that, which is a second theme of the story, is that even though she doesn't have a voice, she doesn't try to distinguish herself and show herself like her best self before the prince, so that the prince can actually see her and, see all the other things she has to offer. She just kind of becomes like a hanger-on to the prince. She's just always following him around and just obsessing over him and almost limiting herself by not allowing the other parts of herself to come through. Sometimes she has a moment where she dances and you can see how beautifully she dances, but she doesn't do that enough times or in enough ways or from the right kind of place to actually say, look at who I am, look at all the things that I have to offer, that even if I can't speak, I can still show you the range of who I am. She doesn't exactly figure that part out, which is why it's coming from this unhealthy place. It does ultimately lead to her undoing. So that's one thing. Also from Ariel, who's telling the story, she keeps saying, I wish someone would have told Sienna that every creature actually has a soul. Every creature has to have a soul to exist. So what she was doing, she gave up everything to chase after something that she had already. And part of that she sort of blames, she doesn't exactly use the word blame, but part of that she sort of blames on Sienna's upbringing. Sienna is a princess to the king. She's always been raised up above others. She has a grandmother who's fed a lot of not great stories into her to say, like, everybody always serves the princess. You are the best and you are the most. Never expanding her vision to see other people and to see the qualities in other people, which is why she can fixate on things. And she's been so spoiled her whole life that she just thinks she's going to get it without having to work for it or earn it or things like that. And then again, also coming back to the main point that she keeps saying, we cannot exist if we don't each have a soul or a spark, a divine spark within us. I try not to sit too much on the religious aspects of this, just because it's not necessarily the story that was being told, but we do have this idea of soul and divine spark comes up often because, even in a world of mermaids and magic, yes, that could still, I think that it can coexist. And also, like, what are mermaids humans or not, or what are they? I don't know. But she sees we're all functioning beings, and we make decisions. We have minds that we can think with. We have ways to express ourselves. She sees herself as we're like the humans of the sea almost. That's kind of the way she views. That's kind of the view on mermaids in this story versus the humans that are on land. Even though the humans can't know about the mermaids because that would just be unhealthy. So you have that also, that they have to keep their identities a secret. Now, part of this thing about voice, which briefly mentioned before, that's kind of the next big theme that runs throughout this telling. It's this idea of the internal versus the external, and also voice, to give voice to the internal versus the external. But in general, we have this idea comes up a lot, and it also attaches to the idea of soul. Because for those who believe in soul, and that everyone has a soul or a divine spark within them, that is something that's internal, something that we cannot see, right? That's something that we have to look past what seems obvious and physical to be able to know that that's there. Another important thing about that is believing in soul and divine spark and things like that is what allows us to rise above and go beyond the external. Because when we only focus on externals, that's when we see so many all the differences between us. Differences are good because then we're not all cookie cutters, we're not all the same. But differences can become not good when these differences divide us or separate us. right? Or say she's pretty, so listen to the pretty person, or she has this talent, so listen more to that talent, versus saying everyone has something to offer and everyone has something of value within that's inherent within them, right? A soul and a divine spark is something that's given. So everyone is already starting off on a higher level and at a higher place because inherently we each have something that already elevates us and that already makes us more than we would be on our own without a soul, without a divine spark. So that's also an important thing. Now, as far as the internal and external, going on some of the physical ways that that's represented in the story, we have a few ways that we see this. And the examples of this and the scenes with this keep coming up throughout the story because it's also something that Ariel is kind of struggling with on her own. She's very specifically described as not necessarily a pretty mermaid. We usually think, if mermaids are not being described as evil, they're usually considered so beautiful and things like that. She's very specifically not a so beautiful mermaid. She doesn't make a gorgeous person either. She's kind of just a regular person who has certain features that are nicer than others. But as a general idea, she's not specifically beautiful, which goes to the title, Beautiful to Me. Part of what she ends up realizing is that so often, unfortunately, we allow other people to validate our value instead of knowing already that we inherently have value, which again goes back to the soul thing. I believe I have a soul within me. I believe I have a divine spark within me. That means that divinity, God, who's kind of bigger than any human, already told me I have value by giving that to me, by bringing me into being, right? That already gives me value. That's kind of what the theme here is saying. Ariel doesn't learn how to accept that or embrace that, even though she's kind of on the right track for that, until someone actually shows it to her. So she knows that she has value as a person, but she never actually sees herself as being beautiful, right? You're beautiful because you are unique. You're beautiful because of the good things that you have to offer. You're beautiful because you are a creation. You're a person or mermaid that has been born and brought into this world. And because your potential is what makes you so beautiful. She doesn't see that until somebody else not only sees that with her, but forces her to see that within herself as well. Which some people don't like that. Oh, she needs a man to feel beautiful, blah, 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 whatever. It's not what it's trying to say. It's just trying to show the point that sometimes we don't see it until somebody makes us see it. Until someone gives us a chance to see it. Which is what happens with Ariel, is that she says, I fell for the person who made me beautiful to me, as in he showed me. He showed me what I'd been missing the whole time. I had never allowed myself to see it. I'd always blocked myself off from seeing it. Because of, the way she grew up and the way she was always in the shadows and things like that. And when he finally made me see that, and I realized that I am beautiful, just because I don't have the traditionally beautiful features doesn't mean that me as a person, that I am not beautiful. That's kind of the punchline of all that. But that also is shown through this whole internal versus external theme that goes on. So the first way we see it is that Sienna becoming a human, it's a mermaid inside of a human form, right? That's one way we see that. Ariel also is a mermaid inside of a human form. So are you really the mermaid or are you the human? Like, which one are you? Sienna chooses to be the human. Ariel keeps struggling because she doesn't want to be a human. It's not the life. She wasn't chasing anything on land. She was relatively happy or satisfied. She wasn't exactly living the best life in the sea, but she was happy to be a mermaid. And she keeps saying, I want to make sure I'm always going to be a mermaid. And the end of her life, that she's going to live for 300 years because she is a mermaid, she will eventually dissipate into the foam of the sea because she is a mermaid. But that happens. She does live out a human life first and embrace the human life and see all the benefits to it. But to her, she's always still a mermaid, and the sea is always still her home, right? And when she sings, it's always about her real home and the beauty of the sea. She never really gives up on any of that. She never really separates from any of that. Not the way that Sienna does. Sienna kind of denies the whole aspect. Going on, we have the idea comes up again of the internal versus external, because we have one of the other fairy tales that were brought into this tale is that of the Frog Prince. So the Frog Prince is that, well, it's actually a king because of his bad behaviors, was turned into a frog until he was going to learn to shape up, and then the princess has the way they say it when they do the fairy tales, they say the princess has to kiss him and then he's going to turn into human again. But I believe in the original, she actually throws him against the wall. Unless that's just the way I wrote it. That is the way I wrote it. And that's when she kind of like breaks him out of that. So that happens not with the prince, but with the prince's sister, who's the one who actually originally finds Ariel. She's the one who the whole story of the frog prince occurs with, and ends up being the king that she marries and things like that. But that also, you have a prince / a king who's trapped in the body of a frog, right? And when they first find this frog, this big, ugly purple frog, and everyone's kind of like, ew, what is that? And Ariel is the only one who's willing to pick up the frog and be like, yeah, I guess it's kind of ugly, but I'm like, so what? It's not so bad. It's okay, right? She's unafraid of it in that way, and she kind of breaks the ice in that way of picking up the frog and be like, oh, it's okay. It's not so bad, right? Seeing past this ugly exterior of it, or not being turned off, or not running away from this ugly exterior, or disregarding it because of the ugly exterior, and that eventually allows them to find out what's actually inside of the frog. What is the internal of the frog? Usually that's organs, but this time there was actually a prince, a king in there. So that's another time that it's seen. We see it again also when the prince has Prince Orlando, his name is, he has a conversation with Ariel about, this is a fable that's brought in where a chicken is pecking around in the barnyard, in the dirt, and the chicken will just, if it comes across a jewel, it will totally disregard it, right? But if it sees kernels, it's going to eat that up right away. So the chicken doesn't know, obviously, the inherent value of a jewel. It has no value to it, just food that it can eat up right away, right? And that's kind of used as a bigger fable of people who kind of focus on the wrong things, or sometimes that we throw away what has the greater value because we are not refined enough, or we are not opening our eyes up enough to see what's actually of real value. And he kind of says this to her in that way where she takes it, because of the way that the story is told, she takes this as a reference to soul, right? The soul is the jewel that gets chucked away over physical things, right? We tend to look at a person's features and not what lies beyond that. The person, the divine spark, the soul that's beyond whatever casing it's been given, right? Whichever sort of we tend to overlook it, or not even get a chance to look at it, because we get so wrapped up in the wrapping of it, right? Which would be the actual physical body. Last time we see that is when she goes to get a massive pearl. The princess is going to get married. She wants to give the princess a gift. So she goes to get a big, huge pearl. Well, she kind of persuades the clam to make a massive pearl. And that's also another time that this theme comes up, is like, oh, where does the pearl come from, right? How is a pearl formed? Well, debris gets caught in the clam, the oyster's mouth, and they can turn that into a pearl, right? So what is that? What other people throw away and disregard, oh, this is debris, to me, in the right hands or in the right setting, it can actually become a pearl, which is something beautiful and valuable, right? So that's another way of bringing in this external versus internal, and soul, divine spark, inherent value, this recurring theme. It's another way that it's brought into the story. Now, just a few fun things about the way that the story is actually told, and just the way that the universe unfolds. Something that's interesting, because we do see mermaids are magical creatures, and in this universe, the end of after universe, creatures with magic are called magicals. So when Ariel first comes onto land and the princess finds her, it's like, okay, she noticed that there's something kind of different about her. What does she see that's different about her? She sees that her eyes have a purple hue to them. In the end of after world and universe, anybody with purple eyes is a magical. Well, almost everybody. There's one exception. That's Cinderella, and that's going to be for when we go behind the scenes of that. Almost everybody, purple is a sign of magic, which is why purple shows up a lot wherever there's an enchantment, a spell, any sort of magic that's going on, the color purple is there. Anybody with purple eyes is automatically considered magical, right? So she sees that right away. That's why soon when Ariel starts when she shapes her hedges, she could shape these beautiful masterpieces. She does that through her voice, which that's where voice comes in again. She does that through her voice. That's how the mermaid's magic comes out, is through the voice. So instead of someone saying, hey, how can you do that? They can just look at her eyes and be like, oh, she's a magical. Oh, that also helps her, because not just in saying like, oh, how can she do these things? Like, oh, they could explain away by saying, oh, she's a magical. that also helps her in sort of being able to obscure her past, because every kingdom regards magicals differently. There are some where magic is not as welcome, so magicals would not be walk around as openly. There's some that embrace magicals much more, and they embrace magic much more. So that would be ones where they would be more celebrated in. So she could kind of make it seem like she came from a kingdom where magic may not have been as celebrated. So it automatically defers a lot of questions that might have been asked. So that kind of plays into her favor. Some of these rules that were set down, that have been grounded and set down for this end of After universe, play into her favor in that regard. Another interesting thing that comes into play is she actually says that the first night that the prince, we didn't mention this in the beginning, but for those familiar with The Little Mermaid, the prince that Sienna is stalking falls overboard and she rescues him. Now, the way it's told in this story is that Sienna actually initially was part of the cause for why he fell into the water, because she was singing to him. She was kind of acting like a siren, calling him to come overboard during a storm. Now, she sang him overboard. So that is the first mermaid voice that he ever hears. Ariel is the one who actually rescues him from the water. She brings him onto the beach. She leaves him there before he can see her, but he's convinced, the prince is convinced. The prince in this one is sort of a romantic. He's not exactly this like brave, bold. He's probably not going to be slaying any dragons. This particular prince is much more of like a poet and romantic. He likes to get involved in inventions and sciences and things like that. He's much more of that type, which also sort of fits with him from the princes actually falling for Ariel and being so easily able to look past the fact that she's not so gorgeous and so beautiful, not as a thing about anybody else, but just for him specifically, it makes a lot of sense for him to be that kind of person. He's almost like a little bit softer as a person, as a prince. So the interesting thing, which actually goes back to the voice idea, the first voice he hears is Sienna's, but then Sienna loses her voice. The first time he ever really truly notices Ariel is when she speaks up. There's one time they're talking about, they call Sienna, they don't really call her by her name, they've been calling her the foundling. Between the prince and the princess, they're like, oh, the foundling who's just like follows the brother around. And she says, the foundling has a name. Her name is Sienna. And that's the first time you're like, wait a second, who just spoke up? Who is that? And then after that, there's a time when there's sort of like I guess you could say a variety show that's going on at the palace for entertainment. And Sienna just decides she's going to get up and start dancing. And she's extremely graceful. She's beautiful. So she looks beautiful. The thing is, there's no music to accompany her and she can't sing. So Ariel kind of takes pity on her and starts to sing, and her voice is beautiful. Magical, you could say. It is magical, but it's beautiful. And she tries to hide in the shadows as she's singing and let all the focus stay on Sienna. But at the end, when everybody's busy applauding and they're so impressed with Sienna, she feels like someone's eyes are watching her, and she sees that the prince has been watching her. He knows that she's the one who sang. So it's the raising the voice. That's how the prince first starts to see Ariel. Like, she's not just another servant of the palace. She's not just a gardener who's creating these hedges, which is also part of how he notices her. It's the thing that she does. It's the time when she goes out of herself, right? Because speaking leaves the body. Actions leave the body. It's when she does things like that these are actually the things that make Orlando notice her, and not just notice her, but sees the beauty in her and sees all the things that she is. You are not just your exterior. You're not just this outside casing. There's so much more to you. And that's how he starts to see that. So in a way, it almost asks like, what is voice, or what is like speaking up? It doesn't stick to the fact that voice is only an actual audible words that we can hear. Here it kind of addresses, when you're thinking about what is voice, voice is whatever we express outside of ourselves to the world. So part of where Sienna went wrong is that she didn't really choose to maximize on that expression. Just because she didn't actually have an actual voice to speak with, there's still so much that she can offer, and there's so much that she is and can be. And she kind of got stuck in what she couldn't do, and not being able to do those things. So even though she's beautiful and graceful, and she sticks to all the things that are external, she doesn't allow the internal to come out. Ariel, because she has no trust in the external, because the external is not something that she's captivated with herself, she's kind of forced for the internal to do the talking. And when it does get a chance to speak, when it gets a chance to get out there, that is when others notice her, and that is when others see her and what she has to offer. The end is where everything comes together, and ironically, in a way, where Sienna basically has one of the greatest moments that could be had, in the sense that her sisters go to the sea witch to say, okay, she's not marrying the prince, we got to find a way to save her. So the sea witch says to give them a knife. If you kill the prince, bathe in the blood, whatever, she'll get her tail back and she'll be able to live again as a mermaid. So the sisters bring the knife to Sienna. Her other mermaid sisters bring it to her. Ariel finds out about it a little bit too late. She comes rushing into the room. Sienna's standing over the prince with a knife, and she hesitates. She ends up not killing him, even though she knows that that's going to be her undoing. Even though she knows that her life is forfeit if she doesn't kill him. But in that moment when she has a chance to end somebody else's life to preserve her own, and she chooses not to, that it's not just the greatest moment that she has, but it's basically the greatest moment of the whole story in understanding and realizing that. And when Ariel tells the story over and she ends off with that, because sort of what Ariel is doing, she says, I want you to know what the real story is. I want you to know the whole story because it's been so muddled over the years. I want you to know that Sienna, who is kind of this forgotten character, who's made so many misguided decisions, you have to know about the one decision that she made that's a decision worth remembering. That's a decision that's worth speaking about. And it's that moment where she said, I'm not going to take another life just to save my life. And in that moment, that is a moment that can only come from seeing from internal and internal, divine spark, soul, when she chooses not to end his life. And she instead says, all my decisions have led to this, and it's my responsibility, everything that's come to. And so I'm not going to make him pay or suffer for the mistakes that I made. And I'm not going to take another life because it could have been a moment of murder. She says, I'm not going to do that. That is, again, the greatest moment, the greatest decision. But it's also the time that her real self spoke the loudest. Sienna didn't say anything. She still can't speak. But she spoke the loudest in the moment where she said, I'm not going to take that other life. That is the moment when she's heard the most. That is the moment that her voice rises the loudest. By the way, that's also part of the whole thing with the prince and Ariel's relationship, is the prince keeps trying to tell her, I can see you and I hear you, like I'm listening to you. Not just because like, oh, when you speak, I'm listening to you, but I'm listening to who you are. I'm listening to the things that you're doing and what they say about you. I am paying attention to you. He's trying to get her to see that and see that the fact that he's kind of falling for her and has nothing to do with the fact that wherever she's coming from or whatever she looks like, it's because I'm listening and I'm seeing all these actions that you've done and your behaviors and the moments that you've had. I hear what they have to say about you, and this is what I like, right? This is beautiful. This is beautiful to me, and this is what I'm falling for. Which is, in turn, he sort of asks that of her also, like, listen and see the things that I'm doing and see what they say about me. Just as a side note, another thing about the different universes and the kingdoms, there's one scene where Emmeline/Millie from the Rumpelstiltskin retelling, The Lies of a Golden Straw, comes to the kingdom for a visit. And there's a moment between her and Ariel, which is actually told over in both books. It's not told in exactly the same way, the visit, but the visit is mentioned in both books, and a lot of the scenes are still played out. Part of it was also just to play with perspective, to show how each one, just their take on the same scene and how they're kind of interpreting different things differently. But there is a moment, because Ariel wants to have like lots and lots of kids, which is also part of it. The mermaids, because they live for 300 years, they don't reproduce so much. So she never had siblings, but she knows she wants her children to have siblings because siblings have an inherent love toward each other. That's obviously goes beyond the external. She wants her kids to have that, something that she never felt she had. She put herself down so much. So she's carrying one of her children, and Queen Emmeline, Millie, hasn't had children yet. She overhears her singing. She comes into the room and she just tells Ariel, like, wow, your voice is so magic, which it is, obviously, but your voice is so magic. It's so beautiful. In that moment, the baby kicks, and she kind of takes Millie's hand and puts it on, like, oh, feel the baby kick. It actually freezes up Millie Emmeline, who hasn't had kids yet, which by choice, it's part of the other book. She says, see, this is magic. Giving life is magic. It's not specifically spelled out in this book because there's no way to know it, but in the Lies of Golden Straw book, when that scene plays out for Millie Emmeline, that's the moment where she's like, okay, it's time to have kids too. Well, part of it was she didn't want to have because of the Rumpelstiltskin character, but that's when she's like, she can't resist the magic. And life is magic. She can't resist it. All right, so that's some of the things going on in Beautiful to Me. Thanks so much for joining today. Thanks so much for listening in on this bonus episode of Oh My Word podcast. You can find out more about Beautiful to Me by going to my website, eltenenbaum.com. Check out the books, check out the audiobook. It's fantastic. Check out the other books in the series. Share them with your friends. Tell people about them. And also, if you want to see what else we're up to in Oh My Word podcast, you can subscribe to Oh My Word podcast and all the podcasting places. Leave star reviews. And you can follow us on Instagram at Oh My Word podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us, and catch you next time.